Hi, everybody. Welcome to module number 5, Assessment and Confrontation. I'm going to get started. Okay, so we're going to get to why we would talk about assessment and confrontation in organizing at the same time. But first, we're going to take on the two parts. So assessment, what is it? This is one of the things I can get the nerdiest about because I believe, as you can see here, that it's a critical and often overlooked key skill for organizers and leaders. Assessment is needed before launching a campaign, new organization or action, etc. And it's used for local, regional, national, and international work discernment. And then the fantastic Nora has been kind enough to put a picture here of praxis, right? Which the practice of putting theory into action, reflecting, coming up with more theory or edited theory, action, doing it again. So what is assessment? It's basically actually assessing where you're at. It sounds very simple, but we're going to go into some of the different components of what you're assessing. It basically means you're taking a landscape read from a lot of different factors, and you're doing that carefully before you make moves and as you make moves. Now, there's no perfect assessment, but it's an important skill, and the more you do it, the more you get better at it, is my experience. Okay, components of assessment. So components for assessment are varied. A few key components are. That sounds a little vague, but it has a more intuitive quality to it the more you do it, and it's not a simple science where there's just, okay, let me check off, I assess this area, I assess this, I assess this. Like, there's a lot more nuance to it. So when you're assessing an issue or demand, those are the examples I'm using here, asking questions like, what is the tone of public debate on the issue or demand? How large and how strong are the organizations working on the issue or demand? How strong is the leadership working on the issue or demand? How many leaders? Are they connected, collaborative, or at odds? Where does the public fall along spectrum of allies? So we're going to talk about spectrum of allies in a minute. But I can't totally do it here. But one way to think about it would be to do a mapping where you're drawing a variety of different circles if you're thinking about taking on an issue or demand, right? So that you actually are putting in the circles some different areas. Let's think about this. So let's take an example. You know, when we think about what is the climate for the question of immigration work, let's say, for example, 2005, 2006, if we were doing an assessment or looking at an assessment and we picked a year, let's say we picked today and we were assessing, the tone of public debate in 2005 or 2006, there were some of the largest mobilizations the country's ever seen of undocumented immigrants, right? But there was still very much a human rights frame, not necessarily a whole lot of mass resistance, but the numbers were massive. Then you look at how the tone of public debate shifted around arguments around the Dreamers, right? So the Dreamers were putting forth a narrative of, we actually deserve to have rights, we've been here, etc. We want to go to school, which was a very kind of, quote, humanizing demand for large masses in the country, right? Particularly I'm thinking about people who are white, people who are not Latinx, folks of color who are not from the particular community. It was building sympathy and public support. So the tone of the public debate also was able to escalate and hold a higher level of demand, i.e. demand to end deportations, which we started to see really surfacing more and more between 2010, 2011, 2012. That level of a more, what some would call more militant demand, the public debate could hold. After that demand for President Obama to take executive action was met and then pulled out into the courts, delayed, stalled, and is, you know, the right wing is trying to slowly dismantle it, actually the public debate and morale is very difficult. A lot of folks feel stuck, right? And there's also very ascending, pressing movement opportunities that have to do with the movement for Black Lives right now, that are forefronted in a particular kind of way. So the public debate around the issue of demand of, say, ending deportations or comprehensive immigration reform is actually not the most vital or opportune to have wins. Now, let's be really careful. We're going to get to this in common mistakes. Does that mean oppression, Olympics, and hierarchy, that one issue is more important than the other? No. Does that mean movement for Black lives is the only important thing, nothing else matters? No. Assessment means you're actually looking at where are the opportunities. Time is going past. You're assembling your resistance, right? You're assembling your bases, your organizations. And as opportunities are moving past, you want to actually move when there's a window, not when you're going to be moving into a brick wall. Hopefully that makes sense. I think I kind of got into some of these other questions, but you also want to be mapping how large and how strong are the organizations working on the issue of demand? What is the quality of the organizations? And that is often related to the leadership, as we talked about the fundamental components of base building, conscious leaders, conscious organization, being able to bring new people in, right? So some of the questions you would ask around this issue are, are the leaders thinking intersectionally? Do they have strong skills of analysis, of assessment, of base building? Have they built bases? Have they fought and won on local campaigns? Are they ready to actually rise up and do some of this work together? So, here in Arizona, forgive the localized example, but I think it's important to note that actually around the time that demands against deportation were ascending, there were some very strong fighting organizations, and I mean loving fighting organizations, around the country that were able to hold up the constellation of a Not One Word Deportation campaign or other kind of campaigns that were coming up at that time. And that a lot of those organizations, the leaders were strong and had been talking to each other, right? And they were folks of a variety of ages that had intersectional practice, were actually pro-LGBTQ, pro-Black, pro all these other movements they were interacting with, and were good relationship builders, good alliance builders, good base builders, and had campaign strategy arms. So organizations like GLAR, like Puente, like Juntos in Philly, like Song, like others that were able to iterate and broaden the work. We could take another example, but I'm just using it because it's easy because I know that one well. So it was both the strength of the leadership and the size and strength of the organization. Now, where does the public fall along the spectrum of allies? We're going to get to that in a minute. That's basically actually being able to plunk in where are people in relationship to this issue and have a realistic conversation, not in your social circle, not in the 10 people you know the closest, but more broadly, where is the public? So the tone can be a little different because you can have a tone of public debate. The tone in the country in public debate around gay marriage was not quite as telling as what was happening in polls, which I'm not a big believer in polls, but I do think it's interesting when polls are done well and they go and ask people questions about issues of public debate. So, even the right-wing media was kind of saying, calling it a loss for themselves around gay marriage a couple of years before actually Supreme Court decisions were made. But if you look at the statewide variation, the Supreme Court decisions were very much influenced, I think most people would agree, by the fact that the public was moving towards the LGBT movement on this issue pretty rapidly, and particularly people under 35, right? So the tone of what you saw on CNN is a little bit different than where people are actually at state by state, whether that's constituency or electorate measured. Hopefully that makes sense. Common mistakes assessment. So assessment, again, it's not the easiest thing, and you never know quite when you're doing it perfect. I feel like I've learned from a lot of people who had a tried and true practice where their assessment was really showing up and they doing great work, and they were clearly making the right calls because the interventions they were making were clearly needed because they were working. Now, of course, sometimes no move is a move, but we can get to that. Okay. So common mistakes is when you're assessing a demand, for example, in either a local, regional, or national campaign, the demand is sharp, but no one cares deeply about it, right? So, this has been true. There's a lot of really winnable campaigns. Some of them are often called low-hanging fruit that you actually could win. Like it's a sharp, smart policy demand. but nobody is super, super on fire about it. And sometimes no one is in fire about it, but it's deeply important. Or in the second example, the demand is sharp, but people don't care widely about it. So some people care deeply, but it's not widely enough held. So for the second one, I think a great example would be campaign finance reform. I actually think campaign finance reform is really important. I think it's really necessary. I think there are definitely people who care deeply about it. But in terms of how it plays cross-race, it has been an issue that has been very much centered, with some exception, but not a lot, around white progressives, often middle class, that want to make certain interventions. They see the structural importance of it. And they're also not often as concerned about, their kids being shot while black in the street, basic protections for their LGBTQ families, etc. Not to say it's not important. I think it is. But a lot of times folks have had one-on-ones with me like, oh, well, the bases you work with, constituencies you work with, can you talk them into campaign finance reform? I'm like, I don't see it. I don't think we've actually been able to bridge campaign finance reform into something out of what I would call kind of a dry toast demand. Like, people are just like, I'm not really trying to eat that. Again, not widely felt enough. Very important and deeply felt by some. Okay. Demand repetition with no iteration or innovation. So that's a lot of words with tan in them. So that might not be the clearest. It's actually a pretty simple thing. So you keep repeating a demand. You don't make changes to it based on new information. You don't innovate it, etc. Then what you're often ending up with is demand saturation, right? So you go and stand out and you hold up, your sign for, Black Lives Matter, for example, right? In your mostly white community, and you're there every Sunday, And the first couple Sundays, you got a lot of press, or new people were drawn to your cause, or the congregation itself had challenging but helpful conversations about it, and decided to put up a banner. But now you're pretty much out there every Sunday. No new people are coming in. It's no new hat with press, and it's just repetition. So I want to say carefully that repetition is not always a bad thing. It's with no iteration and innovation is important. Let me give you an example of a tactic repetition. Let's move to that again. So in demand repetition, it's the same thing. Say Black Lives Matter. The tactic repetition is the part where you're standing on the street corner, right? Tactic repetition is a lot trickier because it doesn't mean that there shouldn't ever be repetition. Same thing with the demand. It's the same thing. So let me give you an example. So in Fort Worth, Texas, there's a set of people organizing, and they've been organizing since Sandra Bland was murdered one way or another. And their demand has been the same. Hashtag what happened to Sandy Bland. Hashtag Sandy still speaking, right? This past week, it was a year since Sandra Bland was held for 64 hours at their local Waller. I think it's a prison facility. Can't remember if it's a jail or prison. For a year, they have been organizing around this case. They have said, this is what it looks like for us to focus on this case. Google them if you haven't heard about them. They're very interesting. So they spent the night, they projected an image this week of Sandra Bland onto the wall of the Waller facility, and used videotapes of her talking about the rise of the movement for Black lives, why it's so important, etc. And they sat out there. They sat out there for 64 hours, as long as she was inside there. Now, some people would say that's the same demand. What happened to Sandy Bland for 367 days? Why? That's the same tactic. They've been sitting out there. They've sat out in front of, their local police station, etc. Well, yeah, they're not getting as much press as they were, but they are setting an example nationally of what it means to not jump from horrific case to horrific case. of Black folks being murdered. What does it mean to actually stay with this case? So there is no perfect organizing. None of us have the answer. Otherwise, we would have won already. But it doesn't necessarily mean that repetition can't be important. I would argue that they actually are repeating, but they're also innovating their tactic in order to deepen their demand. Okay. Assessment used as an excuse by those who are comfortable with the status quo to urge constituents to wait, quote unquote, on their issues. Okay, so sometimes people are just like, this is not timely. And it's actually based on not wanting to confront or polarize and be able to avoid conflict. We're going to come to that in confrontation, but that's not what assessment is used for. Assessment is used, excuse me, to actually figure out how to do the needed thing to escalate and win as much as you possibly can in particular moments. It's a very assertive practice. If you're not doing it in an assertive way, I would argue you're not doing it as well as you could. It shouldn't be about making excuses for what you're doing or not doing. Sometimes you're like, we see this moment, we don't have the force to do as much as we could with it. It's okay to be honest about that. Okay. I think we already covered assessment is mistaken for playing favorites with groups, leaders, or issues. You know, I personally think that for a variety of reasons I could go on and on about, my assessment is that the moment we're in the movement for Black lives, there are massive opportunities and that we should be moving very assertively towards those opportunities. That does not mean that I am not as committed and invested to all the other movements that I have been privileged to get to work with or work a little bit in. I think they're very important. I think we have opportunities right now. Assessment is seen as a tool in planning that throws some issues or constituencies away. Again, when focus is mistaken for dismissal of real suffering, real issues, and problems that a variety of different communities are having. Organizing is about what is possible with who you're working with at what time in many ways. And so that doesn't mean that you can't use messaging frames that are broad enough to actually say, this is the big picture, this is what we're focused on now. Assessment is used without deep listening, developing intuition, and emotional intelligence competency. Now, we know emotional intelligence is a contested term, but I'm using it here for lack of a better sense. That, like, if you don't have the depth of relationship to actually know how other leaders are doing and how the organizations are functioning, if you're not in enough just show up relationship, it's really easy to do a very dry meta assessment. You're looking at, you're using media to help you assess, you're using polling to help you assess, you're using what you're reading on websites of other groups, but you're not actually feeling the pulse of what's happening, because most of this work is about relationships. And this is just by the way, a lot of this might sound really overwhelming when you're thinking on the national level, but think about if you're thinking about a local campaign, right? So if you're thinking about local campaign and assessment, you're thinking about who are the local players, making a list of the organizations here, who, what are they working on? How skilled are they at coalition work, or how interested or how much capacity they have for that? What is the quality of the leadership, the relationships between them? What are the campaigns that have happened in your town before? What might be aspirational and exciting that's happening in your town? Your town could be 15,000 people. You could do some amazing work. It's not always about that kind of scale. Okay, so let's talk about confrontation. And the reason that these two are together is because assessment, again, like I said, it should be a robust, assertive process. And it has a relationship to confrontation, because your assessment is also going to help you figure out what level of confrontation you're doing in the work. Now, when I say confrontation, I want to remind us back to one of the other modules when we were talking about that wonderful model that my buddy Rodrigo shared with us, right? About with the state, without the state, against the state. Right. So when we talk about confrontation, we're not always necessarily saying there's only one mode. Like, we have a lot of modes, but we think it's really important to talk about, because I actually believe that a lot of faith communities and a lot of spiritual communities of up and coming organizers, whether they're organized into a spiritual community or whether they have that spiritual orientation towards the work, have great opportunity to strengthen the practices that are happening in movement building right now around different kinds of confrontation. So confrontation, what is escalation, right? Escalation is simply the art of turning up the heat on a tactic, right? You do a sit-in at a police precinct. You stay for 2 hours. 2 days later, you stay overnight. You come in with camera crews the second time you go. The third time you go, you stay overnight. You start getting closer and closer to the building itself to see if the cops will arrest you. They don't arrest you. So the fourth time, you have the media there. You have more people. You stay overnight. And in the morning, you go inside. Then they're probably going to arrest you, right? So literally escalation. That's an example of tactical escalation, but there's different kinds of escalation. This is, I think, very important and not always that popular in this particular moment we're in. Knowing how to escalate and de-escalate a tactic are equally critical. Okay. De-escalating a tactic is actually just how you bring it down, or the same way you think about if you're in a conversation with someone and they're angry. Some of us have better skills than others at either people are escalating each other or one person's escalating and the other one's de-escalating, right? It's pretty rare that two people are de-escalating. That's kind of rare, but it happens. Why is this really? They're both important. They impact people differently. So one thing that's important to say is it's really important to look at our cultural backgrounds and our cultural identities and how they play into how we think about escalation and de-escalation. There are really different cultural experiences around what is more comfortable or safer in terms of escalating or not. They're impacted by class, they're impacted by race, by culture, by gender and sexuality, by what ways of surviving have kept people safe or not. So most of the time, people in communities are good escalators or they're good de-escalators. Very few people are good at both. We need more people that are good at both. I'm not that great at both. I'm a better escalator than a de-escalator, but I'm working on it. And I'm committed to being better at both. So that's why most people tend to be better, at one or the other. I also think it's important to name that for those of us who subjugation and repression from systemic oppression manifests really differently. So for some people, if they're feeling like I've just been subjugated culturally and politically, spiritually, my whole life, like I'm just going to escalate. Like the top is open, like I'm going to be in my power. There's a good amount of buildup underneath that I often watch this play out in racial dynamics where you'll hear white folks be like, why is that Black woman so angry? Like, why is she, quote, so out of control in the escalation? Well, chances are, people are really angry for a whole bunch of reasons. They're escalating for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we lose control, but a lot of times what looks like losing control might not be. There might be really different understandings of what that looks like. These are really important issues to be able to think about, to nuance the discussion. There are many ways to escalate. This is also really important. There are silent forms of escalation, right? Not all escalation involves shouting. Not all escalation even involves direct action. Increasingly escalated boycotts can be very powerful. Increasingly escalated letter writing campaigns, if used very carefully, that's not as an effective tactic, I would argue, as it was 10 or 15 years ago. You can escalate very, very peacefully. In fact, I think having a loving discipline doesn't mean it needs to be quiet, but there's a lot of different ways. Another one, I think probably somewhat contested, but I would say that inexperienced organizers often escalate on the, quote, wrong target, or people that cannot give them what they want, demand, or they never escalate. So the wrong target doesn't necessarily mean that someone you escalate on during a tactic, there's anything wrong with being pissed at that person. I'm speaking from personal experience, having done this myself. What can be true is that you can be escalating on, let's say, an individual security guard, right? Or you can be escalating on the administrative staff of a corporate building you're trying to get inside, if we're talking direct action organizing, right? Or you could be escalating on the, Asian American woman in her mid-60s who works at the office that's denying you social service benefits, quote unquote, or disability, right? Okay, that might happen, but the reason organizing pushes for discipline around target is it's actually asking communities to say, who can give you what you want? Or what can give you what you want? What are the who's that can give you what you want? The board of directors of that corporation can give you what you want. The security guard on the ground floor that you're trying to get into can't. So just thinking about what is the practice. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you go off on a security guard, you're a bad person, there's something wrong with you. It just is not going to necessarily get you what you want. The other side is that people are never willing to escalate. Happens all the time. We practice, we have a conversation, we're going to do this action, or, this is the next step of the campaign. Everybody's prepared. And someone who's really conflict avoidant in the moment just freezes. They had a role, they were assigned, they were supposed to stay on a certain subject, like not let themselves be deterred. They were supposed to agitate. We're going to come to agitation in a second. One particular person, and they just roll over. They just can't. Does this mean they're a bad person or they can never escalate? No. The other side of it is, just as some of us need to learn more about de-escalation and understand that it's a methodical skill you can learn, escalation is also a skill that you can methodically learn. You can practice, and you can literally get better at, if it's something you struggle with, sitting in the discomfort. Not only that, you can get better at doing it in a loving way. So I'll give you an example. When we were doing work to end deportations, we did a sit-in at the Equality Caucus, which is the caucus of LGBTQ congressional representatives that, see themselves as representing the community. And the executive director there was very pissed, and had many conversations with me and a number of us about, like, why are you doing this to us? We're on your side. Like, why would you target us? We've been pro-CIR. But of course, they hadn't made any moves around the way that trans women of color were being treated in detention. They hadn't made any strong statements about ending deportations, even though the deportation record was at an all-time high. And the thing that we said was, you haven't been our enemy, but today you have an opportunity to be our champion, because we just can't wait. We're not trying to disrespect you, but these issues just can't wait. Now, of course, this was said by an escalator and de-escalator, a couple of them much better than me, but I think you get the feeling it doesn't have to be in a way that goes against your core values about the humanity of your quote-unquote target. You can still learn how to sit in that discomfort and the firmness. Okay, let's talk about agitation as a form of confrontation, because it's a little bit different. So a lot of people get confused about agitation because there's a very strict sense from Malinsky organizing of what agitation is, but a lot of people use it in this broader sense. So we're just going to go for that. If you're trained in old school agitation, bless you. It's very effective in certain ways. I wish I was better at sometimes. But the broader sense is agitation is the art of lovingly challenging someone to be accountable to a community, particularly in their own self-interest. It's sometimes seen as the stirring up of soul necessary to remind us that we need to actively push for change. Now, it's not the same as bullying or guilt tripping. Very important. It's used to activate the base. So if you're agitating a base, you might be assertive or negative or be trying to pick people apart. So like Alinsky style agitation, there's an emphasis on like trying to actually toughen up organizers by agitating them. So you look for their weak spots and you're pushing on them because you want to toughen them up. Agitation, when you're using it to agitate your own base, is often, you want to be careful because it can bring up really painful stuff, right? But for example, a lot of the agitation that I've done for LGBTQ communities, it's reminding people, connecting people with the history of how long we've been putting up with all of this crap, what it's looked like, how powerful it is that our people have pushed back before, how pressing the issues are, how many of our community are suffering every day, that we have the relationships, that we have the political power, that what we need is our people to move on this particular issue. And that I know, also as an LGBT person, we can give into numbness, we can give into loneliness, we can give into anguish and longing. We know that our lives don't get that much better over 30 to 40 to 50 years. Straight people might not know that about us. We know how much it continues to hurt. What do we do with that? what do we do with that? Do we do what our people are asking us to do? Or do we do what is the easiest thing to do, which is continue to think, this just impacts me. I'm the only one in anguish struggling this way. No, there's a bigger we. We have a responsibility to it. We need you to give $25 right now. We need you to sign up for this. We need you to come to this demonstration, blah, blah, blah. It's hard to tell if I'm agitating any of you correctly because this is just a video, but that would be a little example, right? So you're really reaching in. Now, it's very hard to agitate a base of a community that you don't come from. You can do it, but you got to be a lot more careful, I think, about how you frame it. Spectrum of allies. There it is. All right. Polarization. So hopefully some of you, even if you didn't do all the readings, not worried about it. We all have a lot going on. Maybe you read the chapter, The Dividers, in the book, which uses ACT UP and the first struggle in the U.S. around HIV and AIDS, because it's still a struggle today, as an example of the dividers. So polarizing an issue is actually trying to take an issue and push people to two directions. So let's explain spectrum of allies for those who haven't seen it before. So this has come out of a lot of different kinds of organizing uses this, but union organizing uses it in a particular way. So if you're thinking about where people are on your issue, quote unquote, and who is sympathetic, you can use spectrum of allies in a helpful way. So let's use the example because it's pretty classic of ACT UP for a minute. There's a lot of other ones we could use. Active allies. So I hope I have this year right. Let's see. In 1972, you didn't have a lot of active allies to the LGBTQ community. In fact, a lot of the community was closeted and wouldn't even be able to move that freely or consider themselves able to move that freely inside of active allies. You had a bunch of passive allies, a lot of people allied to themselves or their other LGBTQ family. And then you had a lot of people who were, sitting at home thinking, I don't really think there's anything wrong with my gym teacher being gay, with my plumber being gay, with the fact that my kid is gay, but it's not really anything to say about it. Then you have the truly neutral, which would be a lot of the kind of like just straight folks, not on the right, not on the left, don't really care, don't need to hear about it that much, but are quite neutral. Then you have the passive opposition. Passive opposition is like, I don't really like the fact that some of these conversations, I want to make sure, because it's 1972, that these conversations stay down. I don't want to hear about it. I think things are good the way they are. Let's have them be quiet. Active opposition is the right wing, which, in 72 was not quite as fundamentally turned up and rowdy about being in active opposition. But as you move towards the 80s, they become very loud. So what did ACT UP do? Something very controversial, right? They basically took a small group of several hundred people who knew that either themselves or their loved ones were dying of HIV and AIDS. Mostly white, but not as white as people remember ACT UP as being. Mostly male-identified people, but not as male as a lot of people remember being. And they were like, we're going to design tactics. We're going to use tactics that lead to actions that really, really piss people off and really polarize people hard on what's going on, because we actually need the pharmaceutical companies to bring the prices down, and we need what later became the AZT cocktail, right? Much more effective drugs was what they were calling it then, around. So they did stuff like, shutting down the stock exchange. They did, famous actions inside of churches, things that really, really pissed off the active opposition and moved the passive opposition towards active opposition. And it took a lot of the neutral people and actually moved them to passive opposition. But what did it do to the passive allies? It moved the passive allies into a much more active role, and it took the active allies and made them into gladiators, beacons of social change, right? Where people were absolutely making that lifetime transformative commitment. Even the ones who didn't make it, who didn't live to see it, completely galvanized and mobilized them. So there's an example of polarization. Not fun, not fun for a lot of people in a lot of ways. We're seeing, we could put a lot of other examples of polarization right now. The very sad irony, of course, that you can have something like the movement for Black Lives that's actually taking a pretty loving, middle of the road tone, and it's deeply polarizing. It's deeply polarizing because the U.S. is anti-Black. Anyway, it can be done in a firm and loving way. I think I gave an example of that, in the earlier slide. To maintain polarization is tiring and can be scary. So this is really important. You have a moment where you polarize about an issue, where you ask, which side are you on? Pick a side. Are you with us? Are you against us? But if you stay in that space without continued assessment, if you're not building sympathizers, like if there are not a good amount of passive allies moving to active allies, maybe even some neutrals move to passive, if you're losing support rather than gaining and being seen as more insular, you're putting your core group in a lot of danger. If you're losing public sympathy at the broad scale, you might want to think about how you shift. That's when people talk about a polarizing moment. Usually, they don't talk about staying in polarize. It can be not a very good strategic move. Polarization can result in self-righteousness if not done carefully. Also very important. The us versus them then can lead the political actors to believe that they have the corner on oppression, that the worst things that have ever happened in the world have happened to them personally, not their ancestors, like them, and that no one else understands and there are no other pressing issues ever, right? That's actually not a good look. It doesn't spiritually grow the work. And polarization, a lot of people don't like it, but there's historical precedent. It can be incredibly effective. Most people who study social movements would agree that the AZT cocktail came about and led to other drugs because of what ACT UP did. That you can almost draw one clear line in history. Now, the AZT cocktail has been helping people live longer with HIV and AIDS on every continent on this planet, in almost every country in the world. What is the problem? A lot of people can't afford it. So that's a whole nother subject. But the fact that it exists, the pharmaceutical companies didn't wake up and say, we're going to make this. We're going to make this. Hey, somebody told us that they're loving us and they care about us and they're having a calm conversation with us about it. They came to our office dressed up. They tried to speak our language and talk to us. And that worked. We decided to donate this huge share of our profits to come up with the AZT cocktail as a solution. That would not happen. I don't think that would ever have happened, because I think what you have is those people's lives in that moment were completely disposable to those corporations, as thousands and thousands of people's lives are disposable now, which is why you need to have pushback in a lot of forums, polarization being one of the most controversial ones. Okay, so rounding out, finishing it up, confrontation as an invitation. So when we think about the kind of soul work we're trying to do, the kind of spiritual growth, I invite us to think about what are the possibilities of how confrontation can actually help us mature in our understanding of organizing, but also mature in our practices of love and bring a greater amount of discipline to our social change work. We talked a little bit about racialized notions of how people deal with conflict based on class and race, as well as a lot of other identities. But just keeping in mind, how are we really self-reflecting? Like, what ideas come up in an organizing meeting that we don't like? Do we not like it because we don't think it's going to help us get closer to our goals? Or do we not like it because it makes us uncomfortable and we don't want to do it? And we don't want to admit that we don't want to do it. So a lot of times nowadays, people will ask me what I think about inaction. And I never answer right away because the climate is so polarized around protest and the spectacle of protest and is it good or bad. The first thing I ask is, what is the goal? What is the goal? I can't tell you what I think about that tactic or an action that comes from that tactic unless you tell me what your goal is. And I don't need to know your 10-year, I don't need a manifesto. I'm talking about a very simple goal. You know, we want to create visibility for XYZ in this local town. Okay. Then I can help you think about that. But I would just encourage you to hold some self-reflection on what comes up for you about a tactic. Same thing. It's like, you know, let's keep doing these actions. You know, we're going to shut this down. We're going to shut this down. We're going to shut this down. I'm going to say, what is a goal and how are you getting closer to that goal? I'm never going to think it's a bad thing. I think it can get the goods a lot of time. So in short, can be a chance to live on the side of love and practice what that means, can help us deepen our covenant and practice. Ideally keeps us in reality while also not forcing us into the simplicity of good guys and bad guys, right? That's that piece about who can actually give you what you want. How can that actually happen? And you need to have a stronger understanding of who's good guys and who's bad guys, right? What is institution and what is individual actors? Individual actors can make very problematic, violent choices. They're also part of a system. And then finally, that piece about can help us deepen our covenant and practice. If we've made a commitment, we're going to do something, then going back to when we're in that meeting, if it makes us uncomfortable, we need to say that, or we need to be willing to do it and push past that discomfort anyway. Or we need to have the courage to say, I don't think it's strategic. I don't know if that makes me look like I'm not down, y'all, and I'm not ready, guys, but I don't think it makes sense right now, and I'm willing to say why. And I'm willing to be part of a solution to a problem that many of us are experiencing organizing, where we've lost the ability to have a rigorous debate offline, to actually have a disciplined difference of opinion that sharpens us to a better strategy. And that's what we need more of. And so that's what having real covenant about engaging different kinds of confrontation can mean. All right, y'all. That's all for this one. Take care.